Hi, my name is Andrew Gonawela. Welcome back to the Burn Bag Podcast. Sorry for the little gap in episodes. We wanted to make sure we're going to get some good content to cover what's been happening with Iran. A lot's been happening with Iran. Joining me here today is Javed Ali, someone who I would call a mentor, a friend. He was a former National Security Council Senior Director for Counterterrorism, has a long national security career, and is now an associate professor at the University of Michigan's Ford School, which is also my alma mater. So, Javed, thanks for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Andre, always great to be with you, and it's so neat to see where you've taken the burn bag now, literally 5 years after we actually
Yeah.
started it way back then. So, congrats to all the success you've had.
Yeah, and I will say Javed was a co-founder as well. So, I mean, he helped us get this thing off the ground. So, much appreciation to Javed. But let's take a step back, folks. As you heard, the U.S. bombed Iranian nuclear sites over the weekend. We saw what I would say was very choreographed and staged Iranian retaliation, really over the skies of Qatar. And then we saw a ceasefire break out that was apparently U.S. brokered between the U.S., Iran, and Israel. So far, on Wednesday afternoon, that ceasefire is holding. But before we dive into the conversation, I want to sort of set the stage, provide some framing, and really tell you all about the timeline since October 7th of Israeli and Iranian engagement of the conflict in general. So October 7th, we have the Hamas militants storm into Israel from Gaza. They kill 1,200 people and they take 250 hostages in this terrorist attack, the deadliest attack on Israeli soil in decades. Iran, a longtime backer of Hamas, publicly supported the assault. Over the following months, Israel's campaign extended beyond Gaza, striking Iranian-linked targets across the region. In February 2024, Israel sabotaged a major Iranian gas pipeline. Then in April, an Israeli airstrike on Iran's consulate in Damascus killed 2 Iranian generals. This triggered Iran's first direct missile and drone attack on Israel just days later. A US-led coalition helped intercept most of that incoming fire. The conflict then escalated throughout 2024. Israel killed Hamas leaders in Gaza and Tehran. They assassinated Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah. And in October, they launched the first openly acknowledged strikes inside Iran, hitting missile and air defense sites. That attack followed Iran's second missile attacks on Israel, which occurred earlier in the month in October. Again, U.S. forces helped intercept Iran's missiles aimed at Israel. By June of 2025, as we last saw just last week, the fight reached a breaking point. Israel carried out a 3-day air campaign targeting Iran's nuclear, military, and energy infrastructure using warplanes and drones. Iran fired back with missile and drone attacks on Israel, some of which penetrated Israeli defenses. So as the situation spiraled between Israel and Iran, the United States entered the conflict directly. Washington launched airstrikes on the 3 Iranian nuclear sites, including Fordow, reportedly using bombers and submarine-fired missiles. This was a sharp U.S. escalation, which raised fears of a wider war. However, on June 23rd, after Iran launched about 9 or 10 missiles towards the U.S. base in Qatar, President Trump declared a ceasefire aimed at halting further escalation, although questions certainly remain about how long that ceasefire is going to last. But Javed, I mean, that's the context we are now having that conversation in. So I sort of gave us a timeline now about the last 2 years, but how in general did we actually get here? I mean, throughout all of those events, what were the key turning points that actually escalated the conflict?
Well, Andre, you did a really good job of painting the picture from the post October 7, 2023 timeline, but Israel and Iran's conflict with each other or hostility towards each other goes back to the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979, and that's what brought down the regime of the Shah of Iran, the Pahlavi regime that was a monarchy that had ruled for 25 years. And then over those last 46 years, Israel and Iran, for the most part, were fighting each other via proxies and in the shadows. But post October 7th, 2023, as you described, it all came out in the open, in different corners of the region, and that's what brings us to today. So, lots of things to discuss. One is I actually thought that Israel and Iran would keep fighting longer, especially because Israel, going back now almost 2 weeks, when they launched their military campaign against Iran, and over that time frame up until Tuesday, had hit Iran so hard, and in a way that Israel, even in their shadow war through covert operations and sabotage, and pressure they put on the proxies, had never conducted military operations and perhaps again even intelligence operations inside Iran and at this coordinated way and delivering those kind of effects. So now taking a step back, I mean, Iran has taken some serious blows. It has lost um, probably a few dozen, or at least a dozen of its most senior military officers in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Praetorian Guard within Iran that protects the supreme leader and manages all of Iran's most sensitive national security programs, including its nuclear weapon ones. Reports of probably a parallel number of very senior Iranian nuclear scientists or technicians who were involved in the nuclear program. They apparently have now also been killed by Israel. The destruction or the damage to the enterprise Iran had within its nuclear program, either with these above ground facilities or the underground ones, the damage to Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, the missiles themselves, the launchers, the production facilities, the storage facilities, Iran's air defense network and radars. I mean, and I could go on and on.
Yeah.
All of these things have really, in a span of roughly 10 days, have really put Iran into a corner, unlike we haven't seen, and I would argue the history of the Islamic Republic in 46 years. And now the question is, how does Iran, if at all, navigate its way out of it? And what it looks like, at least initially, and you hinted at this, is getting to that ceasefire with Israel negotiated by the United States and perhaps other partners or players in the region. And then what comes next? Is it another US Iran nuclear deal? Is it uh, a broader deal between the US and Israel and Iran? Or even something beyond that, like some grand bargain of peace and stability in the Middle East. So these are all the things I think your listeners and viewers should be considering in the moment where we are now. But as he also, it's very fragile. By the time this episode runs, it could all be in tatters just based on, again, the hostility between Iran and Israel and each side's perceptions that they're not holding up to the terms of the ceasefire. So we're not out of the woods on this by any stretch.
Yeah, and I mean, when I saw the initial Iranian retaliation, there were some videos on social media that came out about how the Iranian missiles were being intercepted over the skies of Qatar, and then it came out a little bit later that the Iranians had actually given the Qataris the heads up that like, hey, we're going to launch this number of missiles. In my view, they were basically like, hey, like please catch them, because what we saw was, I think, a very choreographed, a very staged, and a very restrained Iranian response, which President Trump even acknowledged in a Truth Social post right after and said, "Hey, thank you for letting us know. We have peace at hand." Uh, so I mean, we have a restrained Iran. Obviously, domestically, that's a whole other episode we can get into on Iran's domestic politics, but getting there to that retaliation, we had the US airstrikes on Saturday. I was just exiting a movie on Saturday evening when I saw the news that the US had struck these three nuclear sites, which really was a surprising move because, as I understand it, prior presidential administrations had been given that decision. Should we strike the nuclear sites or should we not? Striking it would mean a wider regional war. President Trump decided to strike them. What do you think was the decision process behind U.S. airstrikes? What's the logic that was probably playing through President Trump's head as he made that decision, which could lead to something that could potentially spiral way out of control?
Well, lots of really good questions there. So, kind of going back to over the weekend, I had landed at Detroit Airport, having come back from DC, and I think I landed around 7:30. And right when I landed, my phone, after I took it off airplane mode, just kind of immersed in messages and interview requests to go on TV or radio or things like that. But I do think the context was very different. As you mentioned, several administrations, to at least probably the George Bush administration, or perhaps even earlier than that, in a pre 9/11 world, had considered the option of perhaps even this narrow option of striking, different aspects of Iran's nuclear program, whether it was one facility like Fordow, or perhaps the three that were chosen, or an even bigger set of targets. So that doesn't seem to be new, but I think the decision must have come from the moment that was occurring. So it was in the middle of Israel's blistering military campaign against Iran that had achieved all these effects that I described in that long monologue a few
Yeah.
minutes ago. And that I'm assessing must have been part of the decision calculus for President Trump, who could only really make that decision, just given the gravity of it, that this is now a moment that no other US president has had, and Iran had its hands full and was on its back foot from the Israeli campaign. And so why not go forward now? And it also fulfilled sort of a promise that President Trump had made even before he became president the first time, that he thought that Iran's capability to produce a nuclear weapon, or to have a nuclear program that ostensibly gave it that nuclear weapons capability, was unacceptable to the U.S. position. And then he came in office in 2016. He didn't kind of use that option when he was there. Again, we don't know whether it was considered or not. But if your viewers remember, now going back about a week, that President Trump cut his trip short by a day at the G7 summit, and then he came back, and it was reported that in the process of coming back the next day, and I think that was Wednesday, if my timeline's right, last Wednesday, that he was going to convene a full-up National Security Council in the White House Situation Room, where he is at the head of the table, and then the president, when those meetings get called at that level, the National Security Cabinet of the United States is there briefing the president on not only what does, from the intelligence community perspective, what do they think about the threat and the picture, but then at the policy level, all the agencies who could actually do something about that threat, to include the Defense Department, are there to present options. So it could have been, in that span of time, going back to middle of last week, that the Defense Department, Secretary Hegseth, Chairman of Joint Staff, General Kane, presented some of these options to President Trump, and it looks like he picked what I would argue, and I wrote this in a piece in the conversation on Saturday. The commentary got published on Saturday. That it appears he picked a narrow option, or somewhere between narrow and sort of middle ground option. But this wasn't, we're going to war with Iran with a ground campaign that looks like the invasion of Iraq in 2003, nor is it, we're going to target the supreme leader and see if that'll trigger some kind of collapse of the regime or popular uprising. This was something very different. And then, even though, as you mentioned, that was a move no other president had made in recent memory, that then the pendulum swung back to Iran by Sunday into Monday. And okay, what would Iran do? Now, had this been a January 2020 moment, when President Trump also authorized the strike against, which was a very risky move at the time, the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, Iran, that is the IRGC's unconventional warfare wing, headed by a guy named Qasem Soleimani, who was at the time the second most popular person in Iran. Likewise, at that moment, everyone thought, geez, this is going to trigger a wider cycle of conflict between the US and Iran, and Israel was not involved at that time. And the Iranians launched a missile attack against the Al Udeid air base in Iraq. It destroyed some of the above ground facilities. It caused traumatic brain injuries to dozens of military personnel, but it didn't lead to any deaths. And at that point, both sides backed off, which was an interesting moment. And it could have gotten worse, but it didn't. And so here we are now, 5 years later, more than 5.5 years later, and almost the same dynamic played out. But again, the overlay was Iran's military campaign. And again, was there a moment from Saturday night into Monday morning or Sunday evening where the supreme leader thought, you know what, I'm taking the gloves off too, and I still have capabilities that I haven't used or Israel hasn't destroyed? But even if that was a consideration, that is clearly not what happened, as you described. It was a very choreographed response. It was, I would call, sort of performative. And all of the weapons, whether it was a dozen or so ballistic missiles, were intercepted successfully. But had it not been in the midst of this conflict with Iran, where again, or with Israel, where Israel was just hammering
Hmm.
Iran, who knows? Iran may have responded differently.
So, I mean, the ceasefire, I mean, it caught me by surprise. I mean, I was expecting an intensification until I realized that the attack or the retaliation was choreographed. But I mean, President Trump was pretty angry yesterday morning. He was pissed. He dropped an F-bomb to the White House press corps as he was walking to the chopper, asking, what are Iran and Israel doing? They're violating the ceasefire. I think he blamed Israel quite a bit, surprisingly, on his part for violating the ceasefire. And it seems like the ceasefire is holding. But I mean, what could cause this ceasefire to break? Like, why is it so fragile?
Another really good question. So I think there are several things that could cause it to break. One might be from the intelligence perspective, either on the U.S. and or Israeli side. Are they picking up indicators and reflections of threat activity that the Iranians are engaged in that would violate the ceasefire, right? So are they arming the next salvo of ballistic missile and drone and cruise missile attacks, even though they've agreed to a ceasefire? Are they somehow covertly or clandestinely taking a stockpile of highly enriched uranium that has not been targeted or wasn't destroyed and using it to sprint to an actual nuclear weapon? Although that would probably still take, weeks, if not months, and I'm not, an expert, or at least not a technical expert on that. Um, are there indicators that they would plan some kind of terrorist attack or direct it or order it somewhere in the world against Jewish or Israeli interest? Iran and its partner in the Axis of Resistance, Hezbollah, have done that for decades. So if that if those are all or those are potentially signs that are out there, and again, if Iran were to actually go forward and conduct an attack, then all bets are off on the ceasefire, and I think you're going to see a resumption of the fighting. And if the Iranians were so audacious, that's probably the best word I could use, to actually try to conduct an attack against U.S. interests, either in the region or somewhere else in the world, unconventionally, then again, President Trump, I mean, he's already showed just just this like a sliver of U.S. capability against Iran in this really weakened position. And now there's so much military capability in the region, and we can fly B-2 bombers and 36-hour round trip
Yeah.
missions. Um, and that's not probably the full, inventory that we could do from even these kind of strategic bombing operations. So I just think Iran is going to try and sort of live up to the ceasefire to the extent they can, and figure out a way to recover diplomatically, because I don't really see them having a credible military or unconventional warfare response to this, because it would put them in an even worse situation than they are now. And right now, it's really bad. This is, as a longtime Iran watcher, I would say this is the worst shape Iran's been in since the beginning of the Islamic Republic and when they were in the early stages of the Iran-Iraq War. I mean, the country is in really, really, I mean, at the government level and at the sort of national security level, it's in pretty bad shape.
No, I could imagine, but I mean, as a former counterterrorism official who served at the highest levels of government, I mean, what are you most concerned about right now? I mean, you alluded to, right, the idea that they could conduct these asymmetric attacks if they decided to be audacious enough. I mean, they have their proxies and Hezbollah, the Houthis, other Iran-linked terrorist groups. Um, are we looking at the risk of potential asymmetric retaliation against, say, the US. Because, I mean, when I saw the news of the airstrikes, like, sure, obviously, right? Like, I'm going to think about the regional chaos, the regional conflict that could occur. But for me, as an American citizen living in a big city in Washington, D.C., my other big concern is the possibility of a terrorist attack, whether it's Iran linked or a lone wolf. So, how are your spidey senses tingling about, the types of dangers we could face there in a public safety sense on the
Yeah,
homeland?
well, the both FBI and DHS a couple days ago issued a national terrorism alert bulletin. These have been published, routinely in sort of crisis moments. I think the last one was during in the aftermath of October 7th, and now we have another one. But I read it, and it didn't suggest that there was something specific and direct that both FBI and DHS were trying to prevent, like not a sort of ticking time bomb kind of scenario. It seemed more out of an abundance of caution, in the sense that there could be people who are angry over U.S. or Israeli policy here in the U.S. who try to do something more on their own from a lone wolf perspective, and that's not new. I mean, we've seen jihadist-inspired lone wolf attacks for years, if not several years after 9/11, and then we've also seen different ideologically driven lone wolf attacks here in the US. We had one a couple weekends ago in Minnesota, which had
Yeah.
nothing to do with the Iran conflict, or the Iran-Israel conflict. But again, that was seemed politically motivated. We've had the anti-Semitic attacks also recently, not overtly linked to Israel, Iran. But this is an enduring and persistent threat in the US, this sort of lone wolf, ideologically driven one. But there's just always different motivations behind these attackers. So that's persistent. The thing, though, I believe is less likely to happen, again, because of the context and all the dynamics playing out overseas, is an Iranian-backed attack here in the U.S. First of all, they don't seem to have much of a presence here with their own personnel from their security organizations like the Quds Force or their intelligence agency, the MOAS, to pull that off. They can do that overseas and definitely in the region, and Europe and Latin America. I mean, there's a pattern of that activity with those organizations and their officers on the ground. But here in the U.S., it's always been a difficult operating environment to them. Now, again, I've been out of government since 2018, so who knows? Maybe they've actually managed to get people in here who've been undetected, but um, but uh, but again, we're not going to know that from the outside looking in. And Iran, despite this lack of a presence, or what I would argue is a very difficult operating environment for them, that's been a challenge for decades now, since the beginning of the Islamic Republic. And so, over these decades, they've thought about launching relatively small scale attacks here that would be targeted and directed and proportional to things going on overseas, but they haven't been able to actually advance them. The only one they actually managed to successfully kill somebody, and I hate to say that, was back in the early 80s, and they used an African American convert to kill somebody linked to the former Shah's regime, and I forget the timeline, the one that was 1981, 1982, and that's it. And so all these different plots and ideas that they've thought about over that 40 plus year stretch, they've either all been disrupted, or they've been fizzled out, or people have been arrested. And what you see through that pattern is that they usually have to rely on criminals or sort of cutouts, or people who have no
Lone
direct
wolf.
connection
Yeah.
to Iran itself. And again, is that the kind of threat they're still trying to develop here? Maybe, but they haven't been very good at it in the past. Not to say they couldn't overcome those hurdles. But again, that's why I'm less worried about that type of threat than more the lone wolf one, which are always so hard to predict and
Yeah,
stop.
and I mean, like, I think when you think of lone wolf attacks, you think of, like, I think the attempted murder of author Salman Rushdie, who had the fatwa enacted against him by the Ayatollah, I think way back in like the late 1980s, and then
Right.
I think only like about 2 or 3 years ago, someone aimed to stab him multiple times on stage, and luckily he survived and he's doing well right now. But I mean, that's a threat you often think about. Javed, in the last sort of few minutes in this conversation, I want to touch on the proxies because I haven't really heard too much about what Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other groups in the region are really doing. I haven't really heard too much about movement on that side, at least, over the last 2 weeks. So, have you been observing anything?
Well, this is something that I assessed early on in an earlier piece or commentary I had featured in the conversation. Going back to the start of the conflict, I assessed even then that all of Iran's partners in the axis of resistance, so Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, were going to sit this campaign out. Because they've already been hit hard by both, or first mostly Israel, but the Houthis in particular have been hit hard by Israel and the U.S. Most recently, as of May this year, the U.S. wrapped up a 2-month series of operations against the Houthis, and U.S. Central Command said they'd launched over 1,000 strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. So that judgment seems to have played out, that the axis of resistance has been, just like Iran, hit hard, on their back foot, lost a lot of capability since October 7th, 2003. And interestingly, over these last 2 weeks, none of the axis of resistance partners have tried to join into attacks against Israel or defense of Iran or external attacks somewhere else, because either their capabilities have been reduced or their leadership has made the strategic decision, we're just going to sit this one out, and now we're in survival mode, and it's time to rebuild for the future. They haven't perhaps you know, cut their ties to Iran, but they didn't come to Iran's defense either. Nobody did, for the most part. Even Russia and China, Iran's probably two biggest partners on the region, or in the world, didn't do anything to help Iran. So Iran is really isolated diplomatically, and even within the proxy network, they didn't do anything either. And I think they're also in a very cautious mode right now, not wanting to get drawn into a military campaign against them by either Israel and or the US.
So, as we wrap up this conversation, I mean, the big question is, was this military operation that the United States conducted a success? President Trump claimed that we, quote, obliterated the Iranian nuclear sites. There's still a lot of uncertainty around it. There was some CNN reporting, I believe, saying that we did not actually do as much damage as we would have hoped to. The administration promptly countered that, and there's a lot of they said, he said, she said, and so on around it. But Javed, I mean, how would you see success in terms of this U.S. military operation? Did President Trump's gamble work?
Well, that's another really interesting and important question, and it's very difficult for
Yeah.
anybody to know because, and I've said this in other recent interviews last couple of days as this question comes up. Like anytime you're talking about the status of another country's nuclear weapons program or nuclear energy program that has it's not one single facility like Iraq in 1981 when Israel flew a military mission to knock the Tuatha reactor offline. And that was a single reactor that was above ground in Iraq. We're probably, Iran's nuclear program probably encompasses, several facilities, if not, into the dozens. All really complex technical issues about uranium enrichment and centrifuges and nuclear fuel rods and storage of highly enriched uranium stuff, all that I know nothing about, right? I can
Yeah.
just sort of say these words. And so how in the world are any of us on the outside supposed to make judgments about through the combination of the US or the Israeli campaign and then, the three limited strikes against Israel, to the degree to which the program has really been affected? It clearly has been damaged. I mean, you don't have to be a nuclear scientist to know that based on the volume of these operations, and at least on the U.S. side, the weapons that were used,
30,000 pound bombs
right, and the
were cut.
precision.
Yeah.
I mean, Iran got hit very hard on the nuclear program front, but did it quote unquote obliterate the program? Hard to know. I think Secretary Rubio today came up with a little bit more of a nuanced perspective. It was significantly damaged and set back for several years. Is that the same thing as saying obliterated? I don't know, but again, it got hit very hard. And if now in this kind of ceasefire world, would the Supreme Leader and other folks in the IRGC who had managed that nuclear program before, if they're thinking about trying to go back and sort of rebuild it from a clandestine perspective and still try to pursue a nuclear weapon, that I also think, at least in the moment, would be a losing strategy. So I know it's a sort of controversial issue, but it's so hard for those of us who don't know what the totality of that intelligence picture looks like, nor to have the technical sort of depth to make the assessment either. But I think you can sufficiently say it was hit hard, significant damage inflicted on it. Now it's a question of what does that do to the capability? And these are all things that even people like me, there's really no way to know.
And if I may stick in one last question before we wrap, just in like 30 seconds or less, we've had 24/7 media coverage of this situation, this evolving situation in the Middle East. What are we not paying attention to? What should we be paying attention to? What do you wish could be covered?
Well, there's still Israel's campaign against Hamas and the Gaza Strip, and the hostages haven't been returned. Prime Minister Netanyahu's objective of destroying Hamas, removing the leadership and forcing it out of the Gaza Strip, that hasn't happened yet. And then the plight of the Palestinian people, right? There's still 2.5 million people in the Gaza Strip living in a completely war-torn area with a humanitarian situation on the ground, and is aid getting in? And will their circumstances change for the better in the future? I mean, that is an issue that has not yet been addressed. And then, President Trump's vision for the Middle East is broader, right? He wants Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords. I think that is sort of the ultimate sort of prize for him. That Saudi Arabia has said they will not enter into the Abraham Accords until there's a two-state solution with the Palestinians and Israel. So these are all factors as well that haven't been resolved. And there is some media coverage on it, but not to the extent that there's been over these past 2 weeks because of just the intense focus on the fight between Israel and Iran, and then the U.S. involvement, and now everyone kind of waiting to see how the ceasefire plays out.
Javed Ali, thanks so much for joining me here today. Let's catch up soon.
All right, thanks, Andre.